about these is that nearby residents can subscribe to that project and receive discounts on their electricity bill. We then have utility scale projects, which are much larger, up to 200, 300 megawatts of electricity. And then when you look at where they sit in relation to the electric grid, residential systems, or your very small systems, are called behind the meter systems. So these systems sit behind the meter. So the electricity that's taken from the sun, generated from the sun, immediately goes to power that home, that residence, that facility, and then any extra gets shot to the grid. For front of the meter systems, the electricity immediately goes to the grid, and then it's distributed to those who need it. Just for a little bit of scale, ground-mounted solar facilities take anywhere between 5 to 6 acres per megawatt, depending on site characteristics and zoning restrictions. And a megawatt can power anywhere between 100 and 200 homes. Permitting these systems depends on the size of the installation. So projects that are smaller than 25 megawatts are permitted at the local level with you through seeker, through whatever municipal or county requirements that your municipality requires. For projects that are greater than 25 megawatts, they're permitted at the state level through either Article 10 or the Office of Renewable Energy Siting and Electric Transmission, aka ORES. So you want to make sure in your solar law you have something that speaks to these larger projects, because the regulations kind of default to local regulations. There are a number of different considerations that municipalities should look into when looking to regulate these systems. We're going to talk about agricultural primarily, but there's also zoning standards, bulk area standards, environmental impacts, stormwater, taxation, decommission, etc. I will note that the biggest kind of limiting factor for solar is its proximity to distribution or transmission lines. You need, in an ideal world, a developer is going to look for areas that are very close to these lines. So solar cannot go everywhere. It needs to be near existing infrastructure because it can be expensive to build out. But today we're going to focus primarily on agricultural resources. So solar is unique in that it allows the soil to remain fallow if it's sited on agricultural land. This is actually really cool because it restores soil fertility through nutrient deposits. It increases organic matter, microbial carbon, and soil microbial diversity. It also improves the soil's physical properties, it just has a host of benefits. When you look at protecting agricultural resources, there are 3 major buckets that you can look at. The first is using mineral soil groups 1 through 4. These are mineral soil groups 1 through 4 recognized as the most highly productive soils based on the combination of their physical and chemical characteristics. Our model law, NYSERDA's model solar law, uses this characteristic that's defined by Ag and Markets to be consistent with what the other state agencies are doing. So Ag and Markets uses this, ORES, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting and Electric Transmission, uses this, the Department of Taxation and Finance, etc. So it's just to be consistent. Another way to look at protecting agricultural resources is looking at active agricultural lands as defined by Ag and Markets. So these are lands that have been used for either crops, livestock, or livestock products within the past 5 years. The third way to look at protecting agricultural resources is to use the USDA and NRCS's Web Soil Survey map. And this map identifies across the country prime farmland soils, which are soils that have a combination of physical and chemical properties that are really good for producing food, fiber, and other crops. And then you can look at protecting soils of farmland of statewide importance. And these soils don't quite meet that prime farmland classification, but they are protected as mineral soils. So agrivoltaics, I'm not going to jump too deeply into this. Linda will go over this in her section of the presentation, but very quickly, agrivoltaics is combining photovoltaics and agriculture into this kind of synergistic collaboration between solar developers, local farms, and agricultural organizations. It's a really neat way to co-utilize that space. NYSERDA has a solar guidebook that we're actually updating right now, which is very exciting. And we have a number of different chapters that you can see. And so chapter 7, I'll just very quickly highlight, is on solar installations in agricultural districts. And you can see the first version was just, 1 page of a, very short discussion. And we've expanded it to be, nearly 20 pages, and it's going to be expanded even further in the next iteration. But we're going to focus today on the solar law. We have a model law that any municipality can kidnap, use, adopt, and kind of tailor to their community's needs. I will talk today very briefly about it. I'm going to go over the different tiers that we break up into, and then I'm going to pull out the sections that speak to agricultural resources. So NYSERDA breaks up solar energy project regulations into 3 or 4 major tiers. The first is tier 1. These are your roof-mounted, building integrated systems. They can also be ground-mounted as long as they're up to 25 kilowatts AC. So they're very, very small. They're on-farm solar systems. For tier 2 systems, these systems are a little bit larger. They're up to 1 megawatt, or can generate up to a megawatt of power, and they generate up to 110% of the electricity that's consumed on site. So they're just powering that home, that business, that parcel, that parcel's needs. And then we jump to tier 3 systems. These systems are up to 5 megawatts. These are your community scale projects. So they can take up to 40 acres or so in size. The last tier are your tier 4 systems, and these are your utility scale projects. And so these take up typically a number of different parcels, and they're permitted through the state. So what I've done is I pulled out, like I said, a regulation specific to tier 3 on this slide and tier 4 on the next slide. For tier 3, for environmental resources, we recommend that the municipality encourage the developer to minimize tree clearing, to plant native vegetation, and to refrain or not use pesticides or herbicides. And with respect to agricultural resources, we recommend that the facility doesn't occupy more than 50% of mineral soil groups 1 through 4, as defined by Ag and Markets, like we discussed. But this can be exceeded if it incorporates a farm or if the land is not viable for agricultural production because it's too wet or too rocky. And then decommissioning needs to occur according to Ag and Market guidelines. For tier 4 systems, these are your larger systems, your utility scale systems, permitted again by the state. We use the active agricultural kind of ag protection standard. So we say no more than 50% of active agricultural lands, but that can be waived if that land is going to be used for a farm operation. And similar to your tier 3 systems, the system needs to be designed and decommissioned per Ag and Market guidelines. So that's a very brief overview. I do have a number of different resources that we can go through, and I can email out the slides to anyone that needs it after the presentation. And I will pass it over to Linda.
Thanks, Camille. So can you go to the next slide, please? So I'm with American Farmland Trust. I'm the New York and New Jersey Regional Director. And American Farmland Trust is a national organization with regions throughout the country. We have 7 regions now. We were founded in 1980, and we have a 3-tiered mission. We are focused on protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. We work from the kitchen table to Congress. Next slide. So most of you probably know agriculture is really a major economic driver in New York State. The last census, it was worth $8 billion in revenue in 2022. There's over 30,000 farms, which every year we are seeing reductions in that, unfortunately. But it really does employ, when you're looking at all sectors of agriculture, over or nearly 200,000 jobs in New York State. Next slide. AFT has, over the years, done several studies looking at research projects looking at the loss of farmland. And either what's happened in the past or predicting what might happen in the future. From 2001 to 2016, we lost over 250,000 acres of agricultural land in New York. And from 2016 to 2040, we're projected to lose an additional 450,000 acres. That does not include land lost to solar. And it's really impacting a lot of our better farmlands. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of challenges to farm viability besides the threat of development. There is a lack of connection to markets, and our farming population is aging, and a lot of our farmers do not have a succession plan. Next slide. We also have our weather as a huge challenge to farming, as you've probably all experienced this summer. We've had all kinds of tornadoes, and now we're kind of really in a dry period and extreme heat. So there's a lot of things that are impacting farmers and the viability of those farms, and just a real big challenge. Next slide. And solar is yet another challenge to farming. As Camille said, it takes like 5 to 7 acres to produce a megawatt of solar energy. And with New York Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which has a clean energy goal of 60 gigawatts of utility solar by 2050, there's going to be a lot of solar that's created in the next 20 to 30 years. Right now, we have about 4.7 gigawatts created or developed, and there's quite a huge pipeline, about 24, I think, gigawatts in the pipeline. Not all of that will be developed, but there is a huge explosion of solar development, which could impact 300 to 600,000 acres. And with some research that's been done by Cornell and others, probably 80% of that will happen on farmland. Next slide. So, of course, that's why AFT is involved in this solar world, and we've developed these 4 smart solar principles. The first is to prioritize, and these aren't really specifically in any order, just things that we like to consider. Prioritizing siting on buildings and land not well suited, safeguarding the ability of the land to be used for agriculture if it is going to be developed into solar, doing it in a way that has minimum impact on the land so that the soil is not impacted. Growing, the thing that I'll be focusing on today is agrivoltaics. So we'll talk a lot more about that. And then really promoting equity and looking at it from the possibility of a farm viability lens. Next slide, please. So what is agrivoltaics? Sometimes we call it farmer first solar. So it's the simultaneous use of land for solar, photovoltaic power generation, and agricultural production as defined by Ag and Markets law. Pollinator habitat in itself is not considered agrivoltaics. Next slide, please. So thinking about agrivoltaics, we're really looking at agricultural production that's going to happen underneath the solar panels and or in between the rows of solar panels throughout the life of the project. It's really designed intentionally for agriculture. So we're looking at, when we say farmer first, we're looking at the farm and the farming operation and designing the solar around that rather than putting up solar panels and trying to figure out how to farm in between them. It's very farmer centric, looking and considers soil health, water management, thinking about crops and what kind of light or shade they require, and really making sure that it's flexible because we don't know what the future of agriculture is going to be. And so we want to make sure that we're designing it in a way that it can support a lot of different types of agriculture into the future. These projects sometimes, we haven't gotten there yet, but 25 to 30 years is the lifetime expectancy, maybe more. Next slide. So thinking about how we design this and what the impact of agrivoltaics is on production. You hear arguments that, well, you've got less land to produce agriculture, or you've got, you're not producing as much solar electricity. But if you look at this slide, we're trying to show that if you had two fields, one you were devoting just to crop production, one you were devoting just to solar electricity, each of those will produce 100% of solar electricity and agriculture. But if you combine them, you're going to have two parcels that are producing 80%, is kind of the standard, 80% agriculture and 80% electricity. And so you're really adding how much it's an additive of how much you'll be able to produce on that piece of land. So you have a little bit of less energy produced and you have a little bit less crops produced, but together you have greater than what you could do if you just dedicated it totally to one or the other. Next slide, please. So we're trying to change, the AFT is trying to change the narrative of solar and trying to spin it to think about it as a farm viability tool. It really can be a win-win scenario. We are able to keep land in agricultural production. We're also contributing to the renewable energy goals. There's a dedicated income stream for the farmer through this solar lease that they can depend on, unlike just crops where things can really impact how much income you're getting every year, depending on weather and all kinds of other, disease impacts markets. So this is a really great incentive for farmers because they know that they have this dedicated income stream for 20 or 30 years, depending on the lease. It could also help to facilitate the transfer to the next generation of farmers by again, having that dedicated income stream and being able to help those new farmers support them in their building their business. And it also may provide access to farmland by allowing, if you had we hear a lot of times that non-operating landowners, people who just own farmland and lease it, they're not the farmers themselves. They can get a lot more if they're leasing to a solar company than if they're leasing to a farmer. And so a lot of farmers are losing their leases and because of this solar development. But if we looked at agrivoltaics, that landowner could actually do solar and also agriculture on that same piece of land and maybe not charge as much for the farmer. And for agrivoltaics, it needs to be farmed. And so there are some instances we're seeing where solar developers and landowners are actually paying farmers to come and farm the land because they need to have a farmer on that property in order to get all of the other incentives that go along with developing as an agrivoltaic project. So there's a lot of possibilities for new and beginning farmers and just land access. Next slide, please. Some of the benefits of agrivoltaics, again, we talked a little bit about diversified income. We're seeing a lot of, I guess, maybe unintended consequences or things that you might not think about. The shade when you're looking at grazing or even some crops, especially with our increased temperatures in the summer. So there's a lot of crops that really don't do well when it gets really, really hot. And so a little bit of shade really benefits them, as well as for grazing animals when they're out, they're always hanging. When we have these agrivoltaic projects that have grazing animals, most of the time, if it's sunny out, the animals are underneath. It also helps with moisture retention and also frost prevention. So there's some studies looking at putting solar panels over orchards, and it helps with the late season frost or the early season frost and protecting those plants from frost, and also maybe even extending seasons because of that. In some instances, we're seeing increased yields because of the moisture and the shade. And I already talked about extending the seasons. Next slide, please. So communities can plan for solar and agriculture, and Camille talked a little bit about the guides that they've developed and for model solar laws. I think that one of the things that we're seeing or hearing is that communities don't even realize that agrivoltaics is an option. And so when you think about solar, they're just thinking about panel after panel and not incorporating agriculture into it. So trying to socialize this concept a little bit more so that it's not an exception, but it's something that people think about when they're planning for solar and incorporating it into their solar laws. Camille said ORES is looking at is responsible for these larger projects, and the first thing they look at is the local laws, and they're not seeing agrivoltaics mentioned, so they can't even encourage that kind of development based on those local laws. We also need to have incentives for developers to be able to do this kind of to be encouraged to do this kind of development. It does cost a little bit more because for most cases, we're spacing the panels further apart or we're raising the panels up. And so it is more expensive. They're not generating as much energy per acre as they could. And so incentivizing this kind of development is really important. Next. Some unintended consequences of local laws. So if you just have a solar law, most of the solar laws say you can't have it be on our agricultural land, or good agricultural land. And if we're doing these agrivoltaic projects, we want to be able to build them on good land. There's sometimes height requirements, so that might prevent agrivoltaics, because if you're raising the panels and you can only have them be a certain height, then that prevents it. There's a lot of buffers and setbacks that might reduce the amount of solar and make the project impossible, because again, with agrivoltaics, you're kind of using more land resource, but you're getting the benefit of both agriculture and solar energy production. So there's a lot of things. Also, some communities are making laws too restrictive, which when that happens, they're considered unreasonable and they're not even considered during the permitting process. So that can really be counterproductive. Next slide, please. So AFT in New York, we're working to develop a guide for farmers and land trusts and service providers that's really focused just on agrivoltaics. We started it as a solar guide, and as we did these listening sessions throughout the state, we realized that the information gap really was around agrivoltaics, and so we will be developing this guide, hoping to give farmers some power in the whole negotiation process, understanding what they can ask for, and understanding what agrivoltaics can be. There's a lot of farmers who, you can request when you're negotiating with the developer to have a well, or to have certain kinds of fencing, or to improve some of the infrastructure so that it's easier for you to farm, improving roads and those kinds of things. So just want to give the farmers the power to know what they can negotiate for. And even just thinking about those things, sometimes they don't even think about it. There is an example right in northern New York, in the town of New Bremen. The developer is Clear Path Energy. They've done a couple of other agrivoltaic projects throughout New York. This is a 50-acre project. There are 64-foot spacings between the rows of solar panels, and they're 8 feet high to where that torque is, the torque bar where the panels are. So you're looking at, this farmer being able to hay around these panels. And it was developed specifically in conjunction with him. So he, the farmer was requesting this kind of space. Next. So there's a lot of other things that other states are doing, and we can look to them. I'm going to just next slide for time. There's a lot of resources. I think Camille shared some too. And yes, questions. I think his next slide is questions. Oh, more resources. We'll share out these slides so you'll be able to see all of these resources. So I think I saw a bunch of questions in the chat. Christopher, do we have time to address them?
There are some questions in the chat. So I've been copying them over. So that way, hopefully we can, at the end, if you're okay, I can send the questions directly to you. And we can get answers that way. Because unfortunately we are up on time and we do have to get moving into the next.
Sorry about that.
So, no, you're fine. Well, thank you both for coming and presenting the information. I know solar is a very hot topic, and it's nice to see some communities actually taking some of those resources and putting it into their zoning laws to actually work with the solar developers. But no, great information. Thank you both for sharing, and yeah, appreciate everything you both said. So
Great. Thanks, Chris. Sorry about taking too long.
no, you're fine. For those just joining us, welcome to the Renewable Energy Track. So the next session that we're heading into is the Solar Development Mapping Tool, presented by Samuel Joseph with the St. Lawrence County. A couple of housekeeping notes again real quick that we'll just touch on for those that just recently joined, is this video session is being recorded. If there's any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat or use the raise hand button, and we will get to the questions at the end. There should be time for questions at the end of the session. If for some reason we go over the time and there's not enough time for questions, we'll have a copy of the questions that we can send to the presenters and hopefully get some answers and send them back out that way. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn this over to Samuel to provide his presentation on Solar Development Mapping Tool.
Great. Thank you. I'm Sam Joseph. I'm Planner 2 at St. Lawrence County. Just bear with me while I get the presentation up. Can you all see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So St. Lawrence County, it's in the very north part of the state, and we have had a lot of solar development come through. And so we developed this solar mapping tool. It kind of started out with Ag and Farmland Protection Board. There was a lot of concern about taking up prime soils for solar development. And so we decided to develop this mapping tool that can try to satisfy a lot of needs. So the needs that we determined are obviously New York State is pushing for renewable energy. Our agricultural land is a limited and precious commodity that we shouldn't squander, right? I think we all can agree on that. And solar developers have their own specific criteria that they look for. So, you know, as a planner, I always like to think, can we, through intelligent planning, satisfy the requirements that allow for solar development to happen while also protecting critical soils? So I work for the county, and the Board of Legislators had a resolution that they wanted to encourage St. Lawrence County residents, landowners, to use marginal land and utilize the advice for Soil and Water Conservation District prior to sale or lease for large-scale solar arrays. So my goals with this project is identify what the solar developers actually want in their development decisions, identify the land that we want to conserve and protect, and then identify the spaces that can satisfy both criteria, right? So hopefully everyone can walk away satisfied, and hopefully we don't lose half our body when we do it. So I often get asked, why care about solar developers' desires? Why not just identify the areas that we want to protect and then protect them, right? And my answer to that is the development is going to happen whether we want it to or not, right? There's a lot of incentives, economic incentives, government incentives to happen. And so my thought process, or our thought process, is let's get them on board. Let's get the developers on board. Let's get the pro-solar entities on board to protect agricultural land. If they can get on board, then we might actually be able to achieve the protection. So we tried to go about identifying what solar developers look for when they are looking for spaces to develop. And every developer is different because it's really ultimately a business model, right? So they're in it to try to make money. And we would ask some really direct questions like, you know, how far away would you be from three-phase power? Or how far away do you need to be from a transmission line? You know, things like that. Or like, how flat does it need to be? And they kept giving us answers like, oh, well, it depends, you know, and it really turns out that certain criteria, like if they're willing to make compromises on some criteria, if they can get other criteria to be more ideal. But we have to ultimately guide our model. So what we did was we looked at other reports, right? So there's an excellent report that came out in 2023 from the Tug Hill Commission about planning for solar energy projects. We looked at that, what criteria they were looking at. We looked at what the developers were actually doing. So we get site plan reviews that would come through our planning office, and we're like, okay, why did they choose this spot? And then we also talk to the developers and try to determine what criteria they actually look for. So for our model, we decided to use a minimum of 15-acre parcel size within 3 miles of a substation, not a wetland, right? That's a legal requirement. And they prefer cleared land, right? They don't want to have to spend a lot of energy clearing the land, so they prefer cleared land, relatively flat. And so that's kind of what guided our model. So first thing I did was I took all the parcels that are 15 acres or greater in St. Lawrence County. And you can see here, all the pink areas are 15 acres or greater. We're a very rural county, so there's a lot of large tracts of land. And then we mapped out where all the substations are and did a little 3-mile buffer around each substation. And that gives us all the parcels that are within 3 miles of a substation, which is the pink areas on the map here. Can everyone see that?
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Was wondering if you can maximize. It looks like you're in presenter mode, so you have the
Oh, I need to
primary
switch.
slide, and then yeah.
Thank
Switch.
you. Yes, please.
Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay. Sorry, I was on
Thank
the wrong
you.
screen. I have 3 monitors and I wasn't sure which one that was showing. Okay. Can you all see that okay? Yeah, okay. So this is all the parcels that are within 3 miles of a substation in St. Lawrence County. And then we decided to choose what land did we want that we deem valuable to conserve, right? So there's wetlands, which is required by law. So they're not going to develop these lands anyway. We decided that it didn't really make sense from a climate change kind of perspective to be cutting down large forests, like especially older forests, not the scrubby land, but like the larger forests, the older forests. And then agricultural land. I mean, that's this project stemmed from Ag and Farmland Protection Board, right? So they wanted to protect agricultural land. So we identified the prime soils that we wanted to protect. So here are all the wetlands in the county. And we do have the Adirondack Park. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the Adirondack Park is down in the southern part. So we also had to work with APA. This is forest cover from the National Land Cover inventory that USGS makes. So this is a satellite image of all the forests in the county. And so we basically erased those from our parcels, right? So we identified where they were, and then that other slide a couple slides ago, we just erased them out of the parcels. So this is 15 acres or greater, starting 3 miles from a substation with wetlands removed and forests removed. Okay, so here are our soils. So we use the USDA soil class 1 through 8. It kind of ranks the quality of the soil for agricultural production. The lower the number, the better. 1 through 4 are considered really good farmland that can be tilled, plowed. And 5 through 8 have limitations that means that if they're used for agriculture at all, they should not really be plowed. They're like kind of really susceptible to erosion. So they should be maintained in pasture, hay, or timber. So if we were to erase all of our best soils, class 1 through 4, we would leave very little for the solar developers to work with, right? So St. Lawrence County has no class 1 soils. We do have 2 and 3, and we decided to protect 2 and 3 while sacrificing 4, is what we kind of ultimately determined. And then some additional criteria that got added on a little bit later was 0.25 miles, a quarter mile from phase 3 power lines, slope with less than 10%. We wanted to minimize rock outcroppings. So once everything was removed, we continued to erase all these things. We decided that we still need to have a minimum size of 10 acres, right? So like if there's actually going to be some development to happen, we needed those parcels that remained, or those little sections of the parcels that remained, needed to be at least 10 acres of actual developing, I'm fumbling on my words, but spaces that can actually be developed. And that left us with this. And it might be hard to see, and I'll actually go into the actual program so we can zoom in on some of these areas, but these little teal areas, it actually kind of looks gray on this screen right now, but is the acreage that is left. Okay, so that was what we started with. And then we decided that because of legal, once you're going through the process of trying to get leases, we might as well identify the parcels that those 10 acres are on. And we understand that the solar developers are actually probably going to develop a little bit outside of those areas into other spaces. So we kind of just identified the parcels that have those suitable areas. Some other things that we put onto the map, and I'll go into the map in a second so we can actually see what I'm talking about. But another idea that we had was to use land that's already been degraded through various other reasons. So this is all the information comes from the DEC and includes landfills, brownfields, remediation sites, and quarries, whether they're active quarries or spent quarries. The idea being that eventually they will be kind of considered degraded land. So we identified those from the DEC, and then anything that was 10 acres or more, we added to our map as places that we would encourage solar development to happen. Additionally, we added to our project all the land that has, or all the projects have already been proposed before the county planning board, right? So these aren't necessarily projects that have already been built. Some of them have been built, but these are ones that have already been proposed and came before the county planning board. So the purple is the parcels and the black is the actual solar arrays. Once again, I'll zoom in onto the map once we get to the actual project. So this is meant to be a living document, right? That changes and evolves through time. We want it to, it's not like a once and done kind of just presented to the world and people can take what they want. We want it to actually satisfy needs. So we've been taking a lot of feedback over the last, I guess this has been about a year that's it's been up. And some proposed feedback or changes from feedback is they want us to include the data rather than just the results. And so I haven't actually updated this project yet, but we are very close to updating the project. But include the data that we included rather than just the results, so that some planning boards can kind of use some compromise and decision making based on the data rather than this is good or this is not good. They want us to acknowledge what solar arrays have actually been built, which is a little bit harder for us than it sounds, because as the county planning board, we receive projects that get referred to us from the towns, and then it goes back to the town planning boards. And so sometimes the decision making isn't always communicated back to us on whether they approved or don't approve. And additionally, there's such a time lag on these projects that like we will see a project get proposed to us and then it'll be a couple of years before they actually get built. But we're working on figuring out ways to actually show where they've been built and where they haven't been built. I went to a conference not too long ago about the Adirondack to Algonquin initiative, the A2A initiative, and it's this idea of building wildlife corridors. And so they identified a bunch of land that they would prioritize for land trusts to preserve. And they have this whole data set. And so the feedback was like, oh, we should include those corridors in land to take out from the development. And this is actually a big concern with all these solar, especially the large scale ones. The fences might actually impede animal corridors or wildlife corridors. And then the other feedback that we received is to go beyond the 3-mile substations as new substations are being built or new developers are it's all that cost benefit analysis that maybe they're willing to build further from the 3 miles if the conditions are ideal. And then develop and communicate an update schedule. Okay, and then so these are not from necessarily feedback from the community, but just kind of our own internal thought process. How do we address the larger scale development, the greater than 20 megawatt and battery storage, these in big industrial? So we came out with this, we spent all this time making this project, and then we haven't actually received another solar development plan come before the county planning office. But we have received these large scale ORAS projects, right? So how do we incorporate them into our model? They don't really seem to focus so much on the substations as they do on the transmission lines. So thinking about that and battery storage, right? How do we play battery storage into this model? Is the risk of contamination of soil from battery fires or greater than the solar arrays? I'm not entirely sure. And then the last presentation, I don't know if everyone was here for it, was talking about agrivoltaic, right? How do we incorporate that into our model? Like maybe this isn't a yes or no kind of game of like solar or no solar, but maybe these areas we should be like thinking about, okay, if you're going to put solar here, it has to be agrivoltaic. I'm not sure. And then we want to have a better communication with the solar developers. Are they actually using this model? Is this like a useful tool for them? Are they getting buy-in? And I'm not entirely sure about that. Can we encourage them to use this as a tool for selecting parcels? We have some communication when they come, when the planning board meets, we do communicate a little bit. And I know we are kind of pushing them to use this, but are they using it before they get to the planning board stage? And then also communicate with municipalities. And I've been doing this a little bit, but getting their feedback and getting their buy-in. So when they update zoning rules or when their planning boards are meeting, can they also protect ag land? So the county planning board is very strong in favor of protecting ag land. And so the county planning board will deny a project. Oftentimes the municipal planning board will then go ahead and override us and then just build it anyway, right? So can we get their buy-in? Okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and actually show you the tool. So let me, and now I know which monitor. Can you see this, my browser screen? Okay.
Yes.
So I just wanted to show you how to get to it. So it's the stlawco.gov. It's the St. Lawrence County government website. You go to the Find Department, Planning. On the left here, there's a link for maps. And then there's the solar development mapping tool, which is one of the options right here. And so if you click on that, this whole text is basically what I've already told you. It kind of just explains all the layers that are in the model. And you click on the link here to get to the actual tool. And this is just saying that this is all for, don't sue us for any inaccuracies. This is just for education purposes only. Okay, so this is the actual tool, right? This is a GIS model. I probably should have started with this. I don't always know if people know what GIS is, Geographic Information Systems. And so if, can you see my mouse okay? Is that visible to people? Like I'm moving it to the right now.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
So there's this like 3-layer boxes here, right? So if you click on that, that's all the layers that are in the model. And I just find it personally easier to turn these off so that we can just like kind of talk about what we're looking at. All right, so I'm just going to zoom in on Canton. This is where I am. And then the yellow here is every parcel in the county, right? So we can like click on it and get some information about it, the print key and all that, you know, what it's labeled as real properties. But I'm going to turn that off for now. So then the proposed solar in the county are the projects that have already been proposed. And so if you can see this is the purple lines. These are the parcels that have been proposed for solar. So this is a big project that's in the works right now. It's the Rich Road project. It's one of the big, I'm trying to remember, I think it's 260 megawatts. These smaller parcels are what we would consider community solar, which actually comes before the county planning board, and it's less than 20 megawatts. So the purple is the outline of the parcel, and the black is the outline of the solar arrays. So these are all the solar arrays that have already come before the county planning office. And there's been a good number of them. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off. And then this is the actual analysis that we did. So this like teal color here is the areas that we determined based on our soil, wetlands, and forests within 3 miles of a substation that we think would be suitable for solar development. The red is the outline of the parcel. And so we recognize that in reality, if someone's going to come in here and want to build on this parcel, they most likely will go in a little bit into this area, right? That's just understood as part of the development process. But we want to encourage them to think about this, that if they say only need, I don't know, say 10 acres to try to maximize on the less quality soils. And so all these teal areas are at least 10 acres of land, right? And we understand that there's going to be some that's going to go over, but that is. And so there is a decent amount of land that is available for use, right? When I zoom out from the county, it looks like there's none, but when you zoom in and actually using it, there's a good chunk of land. And then the other thing I want to show you is the degraded land. And so these are areas that have been considered a remediation site for whatever reason, whether that's a quarry, an old landfill. Let's see if they can find some big ones. They're just contaminated spots based on the DEC information. And so the idea is that there should be further incentives to develop those degraded lands rather than trying to use our prime soil. So the goal or the hope is that municipal planning boards, developers, solar developers will actually use this tool when they make their decision-making process to encourage development on the good, or the marginal land, I guess, so what we would consider good for development. Is there any questions?
We had one question in the chat, but you answered that earlier when you started showing the demonstration on the actual GIS mapping tool. The question was just if it was there, if it cost anything to use, or if it was free to use by the public.
Totally free, and we want people to use it. Like I said, this is something that we made kind of towards the end of last year and then put it out there. And we are in dire need of an update. There's lots of updates that we want to do, and it's amazing to me that it's already September and we haven't. Life gets away from me a little bit, but we are. I think we have a scheduled date of October 15th where we're going to launch the next update. I am a little bit. Part of the thing I wanted to do with this tool is to try to keep it simple. And I'm worried if I put too many layers, if we start putting wetland layers and prime ag land layers, that it might become too complicated, especially if people don't have a lot of familiarity with GIS systems. But at the same time, I think people do want that, so we probably will end up putting all that information on. It's the balancing act of trying to be communicate very simply and effectively while not overloading people with too much information, but then also giving people the information if they actually do want it and use it, trying to balance those two ideas.
I guess time for one last question. So the layers specifically themselves are the data that's used to build the mapping tool. Is it available for the public or for municipalities to use to, like, say, download shape files into their own GIS program?
I don't think it is currently. But that is something that we could easily do. It wouldn't be a hard update to do. Yeah, I'd have to talk to some people about that on if there's any risks associated with that. I think originally the idea was to encourage people to come here, so as we updated it, it would be the most current thing. At the same time, I think I'm a big proponent of free and open source data. So like just sharing as much data as possible is always a good beneficial thing. Most of the towns in our neck of the woods don't have their own individual GIS capabilities. And most of them rely on Development Authority of the North Country. And so if we shared it with them, that would also share it with them with the municipalities. But most probably don't have the capabilities to download it and actually do anything with it, I guess, beyond look at it.
Okay, no, great information. So definitely appreciate the presentation. If there's any other questions for Samuel or anything else, which I just see one pop up, I will go ahead and make note of the questions. We will send it to St. Lawrence County Planning Department, or Samuel specifically, get an answer, and hopefully have an answer that we can return to you in email. So with that, Samuel, thank you for your presentation. A lot of great information to use. Definitely a great resource and tool that you have there. So that's staying on the renewable energy track. So for the next session, it's on the Build Ready program, which is presented by Harrison Kim, who's the Origination Project Manager, and Brian Geary, who's the Senior Project Development Manager with NYSERDA. So again, same housekeeping tools as before. If you're just joining us for this session, I will go ahead and drop some notes into the chat box. But if there's any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat box. Raise your hand, we'll make note of it, and we will address any questions we have that you may have at the end, with any remaining time at the end of the session. So with that, I will turn it over to Harrison and Brian.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Harrison Kim. I am the Origination Project Manager for the Build Ready program. Just I don't use Zoom very much. Are you all seeing the presentation slide? Perfect, thank you. Just give me 1 second to let me set my screen up. Great. So thank you for taking the time to learn about the Build Ready initiative. As I mentioned, I work as the Origination Project Manager. And over the next few minutes, I will take you through what the Build Ready program is and share with you a brief breakdown of our origination process. At the end, hopefully we can share some details of some of the exciting projects that we've been working on and answer any questions that you may have about it. So the Build Ready program started in 2020 with the New York State CLCPA, and we were ordered to advance development on renewable energy projects on underutilized sites, which by their nature are often too risky for traditional renewable energy development. I heard, in fact, in the last presentation that there should be a program to address some of these more challenging, difficult brownfield sites, and that's basically what our program is designed to do. The sites that we look for include brownfields, landfills, former commercial and industrial sites, dormant fossil fuel generation sites, and parking lots. This program does not compete with the private sector, and we work to identify and develop these opportunities by securing the necessary permits and approvals to ultimately competitively award them to the private sector to finance, build, and operate the renewable energy resource. This program uses a step-by-step process to assess potential sites as exemplified by the inverted pyramid on the right-hand side. Starting at the top with identification and desktop screening, we work with the landowner and community to ensure a proposed project that fits the character of the community and the goal of the landowner every step of the way. Build Ready then proceeds to de-risk the site, including obtaining site control, necessary permits and approvals, conducting and filing interconnection studies and applications, and otherwise taking steps to limit developer liability on the contaminated sites. As a state program and a not-for-profit entity, we are able to enhance our projects by leveraging patient capital and packaging the project with community benefit packages that are custom-tailored to its host community. In addition, NYSERDA is able to interface with other government agencies such as local economic development agencies, DEC, EPA, Departments of Transportation, NYPA, and other public utilities to address tougher problems through a collaborative effort. It's only at the end of this entire process, when a project is deemed viable and ready to build, that the site would undergo a competitive RFP process to match the site with a qualified developer. As mentioned, Build Ready targets the difficult and challenging sites with greater required expense than is typically pursued by the private sector. How we are able to afford these more expensive projects is by offering a greater incentive through NYSERDA's Renewable Energy Credits, or the RECs program, which are typically offered to developers of renewable energy projects for 20 years. Whereas in the traditional market, the developers must compete for the lowest REC prices, Build Ready is uniquely able to award RECs at a higher price, thereby enabling projects with a higher cost of capital. But with the downside, the project must be able to capture the renewable energy attributes generated by the project and connect to the state's electrical transmission system with a standalone primary interconnection. This does mean that, generally speaking, a behind-the-meter project that directly offsets the host landowner's electrical use is outside the scope of our program. The main benefit to Build Ready is being able to address challenging and orphan sites, such as these shown on the slide over here, with a turnkey development opportunity that has no cost or risk to the landowner. Instead, NYSERDA would take on the upfront risk and deploy its own resources to study the site. In addition, the host landowner is not required to devote their own resources into managing their own RFP, and instead is able to participate in the NYSERDA-managed competitive process, which the landowner would be welcome to have a seat. Ultimately, the landowner benefits from a predictable lease revenue for the real estate occupied by the renewable energy project, while the municipality and the community benefits from the potential pilot payments and the host community benefit packages, as well as the green marketing opportunity generated from participating in a large clean energy project to support environmental sustainability. In terms of the ideal site that we look for, it does not differ too much from what the private sector seeks. Like with most project developers, we are looking for larger properties that are sitting near or around an existing substation or electric transmission infrastructure. We prefer sites that do not require much beyond standard environmental and regulatory de-risking. Unlike the private sector, however, we completely avoid development on agricultural land. except where is needed to cross with an easement for an interconnection tie-in or gen-tie right-of-way. We are looking for a minimum of 5 megawatt projects, mainly solar and energy storage hybrid, as well as standalone battery energy storage systems. It usually takes about 5 to 7 acres to generate 1 megawatt of solar energy, but the battery energy systems are generally much more energy dense, and depending on the technology of the battery being applied, it can range between 25 to 40 megawatts per acre, depending on what is being deployed. So that's the program in a nutshell. Before I dive more into the specifics of our origination process, if during this presentation you still happen to think about potential sites that could benefit from a build-ready process, we would love to hear about them. You can send them our way through the site nomination portal here. If you follow this URL, you can find additional resources on the program as well as a nomination form, which will ask simple questions such as where the site is, provide a general description of the site, and any previous energy explorations. You can also find our FAQs, program fact sheets, as well as pages featuring our active projects. So that's a very useful resource that I recommend anyone who's interested in the Build Rate program to go check out. So now I guess I'll dive into the specifics of our origination process. Including the aforementioned site nomination, our site intake strategies also include outreaches to towns and municipalities, which often lends itself to a portfolio-wide screening approach, where we work with the municipality to identify the most compatible sites within the portfolio municipally owned sites. There is a channel partner approach as well, which helps to build relationships with the entities that have a vested interest in finding compatible build-ready sites, such as other agencies and organizations interested in economic redevelopment of brownfields. I also want to highlight that the Build Ready program is eligible for NYSERDA's Clean Energy Communities High Impact Action Points. This is a program where communities with a certain amount of points can leverage them for grant opportunities. Communities can get points just by simply submitting a qualified nomination, and communities that move forward with an agreement with NYSERDA receive significantly more CEC High Impact Action Points. Lastly, Build Ready identifies sites through a top-down screening process. We use various scripted tools to analyze large quantities of parcel data sets and site lists in order to assess them for matching attributes that match our criteria for development. Once a site has entered our screening process, we generally start by trying to identify geographic characteristics conducive to renewable energy development. Our objective is to identify renewable energy projects and identify fatal flaws as early as possible. We start by looking for potential 5 megawatt projects minimum, while avoiding the areas listed here. We pay particularly close attention to slope, the presence of wetlands, especially those that could be state jurisdictional, agricultural attributes and forested areas, as well as proximity to potentially sensitive locations such as residential homes and well-known viewsheds. We consider the potential of other competing uses of the land as well, which could be preferred over the renewable energy development, such as an area that has an attractive waterfront commercial opportunity or residential development opportunity. And those are sites that we try to screen out of our process if we think that renewable energy development is an unlikely future. The next step is to assess the site for its interconnection opportunities by examining the land characteristics of the closest transmission and distribution lines. For build-ready purposes, we're really looking for transmission lines between 23 to 115 kV. These are the larger lines that carry significant amount of power from substation to substation across the state. Once a line is identified, an initial estimate of its hosting capacity can be obtained by conducting a screening level transfer study, which reveals the potential withdrawal and injection limits of a given point in a transmission system. Smaller projects can also potentially connect to the local distribution lines, which range between 13.2 to 34.5 kV. These distribution lines are the ones that you see in your neighborhood that distribute the power from the local substation to the individual residential and commercial buildings. An assessment of the distribution line hosting capacity can be made by entering these utility-specific hosting capacity maps. These resources show the amount of energy projects that are connected or queued on a given distribution line and its host substation bank. By looking at the amount queued and connected, against the limits of the line and the thermal limits of the substation bank, one can determine the hosting capacity of the substation and whether or not there's enough to fit in a new project. Assuming that there is capacity at a given point in a substation, the next step is to determine the cost. The magnitude can vary greatly depending on the site and what is required to connect. With every increase in voltage of the line being connected, there is a big jump in a minimum cost. In addition, most utilities in New York State require a costly protection equipment known as the 3-breaker ring bus for a utility-scale solar project. The 3-breaker ring bus can essentially be thought of as a substation built exclusively to safely connect the project to the transmission system and may cost the project developer up to tens of millions of dollars just by itself. Furthermore, projects that require long interconnection distances or require easements across multiple third-party landowners to reach a line are faced with additional burdens that could be costly and time-consuming to negotiate through. Lastly, as a state program, Build Ready aims to do no harm to projects being already developed by the private sector, and we do take great care to assess potential project impacts to nearby projects by doing curtailment and congestion assessment of the lines to ensure that our projects will not negatively impact their operations. This table here is useful for illustrating the relationship between the potential project size and the interconnection as it relates to the project viability. As you can see, there is a relationship where the greater the interconnection voltage, the greater the amount of megawatts that is required to establish an economically viable project. The top row is actually going to be the amount of megawatts that a project could potentially provide based on the acreage. And the column on the left-hand side represents the voltage range of the interconnection transmission line. And you can see that with each increase in the transmission line, you need a staggeringly a lot more megawatts in order to be able to accommodate each jump in voltage range. If a site looks promising in terms of its geographical characteristics and interconnection availability, the next step for the program is to synthesize all of its findings to refine the project's buildable area profile. We think critically about the site's history and the best use and begin to develop the project's technical conceptual characteristics, such as the type of PV array to be used, whether it's ballasted or ground mounted, whether it is or it is not paired with a battery energy storage system, how much the energy storage system should be sized, and what the duration of that energy storage system should be, whether it's 4 hours, 6 hours, or 8-hour duration. We also could take into consideration other technologies that should be integrated into the project, such as, for example, EV chargers. Once the origination process begins to package and finalize the site for early development, we ensure that there aren't any critical flaws to the project that would impede the development of the project. So we conduct a fatal flaw analysis and code review of the site to examine various factors such as environmental conditions, permitting, and regulations that could affect our project. We would also want to make sure that at this point, the AHJ is fully aware of the project and that we've had a dialogue with them, especially if this project is coming from a private host landowner. We would also conduct financial modeling of the project to ensure that the cost falls within the thresholds of Build Ready and NYSERDA, and advance the site control in the form of a non-binding memorandum of understanding with the host landowner. And ultimately, at this stage, we determine if there's any other studies that would be needed to thoroughly de-risk the site. Once the site emerges from the Build Ready origination process, it's on to review and audit by the Build Ready development team. If the project is deemed ready to enter early development, Origination will push to execute the MOU with the landowner and begin to conduct real property diligence for the project development, while the development team prepares to conduct various development activities. These activities could include environmental assessment, permitting, coordination with landowners and other stakeholders, engineering assessments and design, interconnection studies with the utility, and ultimately preparing the RFP for final development selection and legal coordination with the landowner for the long-term land use and lease. So with that in mind, that concludes the end of the origination process. Before I go into questions, I guess I could show you a couple of our project examples that we've been working on. So this one over here is the BR Benson Mines project. It's in the St. Lawrence County near Star Lake. It's a former iron ore tailings pile that is quite sizable And this is our flagship Build Ready project. It's the first project that has entered our pipeline and is going through the auction process. In fact, the RFP and the developer selection is recently just completed. It's about a 12 megawatt solar energy project that is a standalone with just solar only. It was originally a 20 megawatt project that we've downsized due to the aforementioned congestion curtailment studies, which revealed that at 20 megawatts, there will be a potential impact to nearby renewable energy projects. But at 12 megawatts, that this is a project that would be of a good size. So we've actually reduced the project down from 20 to 12, leaving behind some potential available area that may be accessed later on a phase 2 once the CLCPA upgrades on the transmission system comes in over the next several years. But for the time being, this is a project that we're very excited about. Another thing to mention is this is located within the Adirondack Park area, and NYSERDA was able to obtain a permit with them because, again, it's not affecting a natural area, but we're developing on an already disturbed and developed area. Another project, this is a little bit of a mid-stage example, is the Brookhaven landfill project in the town of Brookhaven, also called the Yaphank landfill. This is a large solid waste municipal complex that was opened in 1974 and is still operating presently, but scheduled to be closed in the next couple of years. And Build Ready is planning a 22.5 megawatt solar project paired with a 22.5 megawatt battery energy storage system. And we are looking to interconnect to a 69 kV LIPA PSEG interconnection that is roughly about a half mile away on the west side of this site. You can see over the picture on the bottom left-hand side just how large this landfill is, and that's the view that you may see driving towards it. So with that in mind, I'll open up the floor for any questions and comments on the Build Ready program.
So we do have a couple questions that came in the chat box there. First question is, do parking lots also need to be a minimum of 5 megawatts?
Yes, parking lots are definitely going to, we are able to look at a variety of different lands, and we could definitely combine different sources of solar panels in order to achieve the 5 megawatts. But for the most part, our minimum project criteria, it tends to be about 5 megawatts, including parking lots. And that's largely due to how expensive and costly the parking lots are. We found that, for example, the cost of steel adds a significant CapEx component to the parking lots that require the size in order to be workable.
Okay. And then another question, or the second question that's in there is, do you do any rooftop projects?
There is no restriction of us doing rooftop projects. However, I would like to highlight that rooftop projects tend to be most conducive to behind the meter type projects, where you hook that up to the existing meter and offset the local electrical use of the host landowner. As mentioned, Build Ready has to build a primary interconnection to the grid. So that means that the project will have its own interconnection and operate independently of the host landowner. If that's something that could work out, we could certainly look at that situation and do it. But for the most part, we think that we could use other lands that are outside and leave the rooftop area for a potential project by the host landowner.
Okay. So we do have a few more minutes. So if anybody has any additional questions they would like to ask, feel free to unmute your microphones and go direct with Harrison with your questions. I'm going to assume with the long pause and silence that we don't have any questions. But I'd like to say thank you, Harrison, for providing your presentation. Again, just like the other sessions, a lot of great information in there to get familiarized with and kind of be able to use and go forward, especially in the municipalities when it comes to the planning purposes. So if there are any other questions, oh, I apologize, I just saw one pop in. Can the 5 megawatt include battery energy storage systems for solar? this is a question from Dean. I don't want to mispronounce your last name, but Galea. They ask because the Croton on Hudson project is only 4.22 megawatts.
Yes, we can do hybrid projects. So if there is a potential opportunity where there's solar, it doesn't quite reach 5 megawatts, and there's some area nearby that is potentially compatible with energy storage, I think that's definitely a situation that we can look at. I do have to be transparent in highlighting that it's still a challenging one where there's really a lot of variables to how the battery energy project would financially model when paired with the solar energy unit. And we have to do a lot of diligence to really identify if that's something that would work, but it is something that we are open to exploring and have looked at for other sites.
Okay. Any other questions? We still have a couple more minutes if there's any other outlying questions. Okay, with that, again, thank you, Harrison, for your presentation and providing all that great information. So with that, we'll go ahead and prepare for the next session. So again, for those that have just recently joined in the last few minutes, this is part of the Renewable Energy Track. My name is Christopher Barbosa. I'm a planner with the Tug Hill Commission. This next session is the New York's Interagency Fire Safety Working Group, and it's going to be presented by Bill Oberkehr. And we do have a couple of housekeeping notes that we will put in the chat box as we get started here. But some of the important ones out there is please remain muted during the presentation. The presentation is recorded and will be available later. If there's any questions, feel free to post them in the chat box. And we can go ahead and address them at the end with the time we have left for questions. And then if you want to raise your hand instead, we will take note of anybody that raises their hand to ask a question, and we will get to those questions at the end as well. You'll have time to come off unmute your microphone and ask your questions. Also, as a reminder, so this is the last session before a quick break. So there will be a 15-minute break after this session, and then we'll move into the remaining sessions before lunch. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn this over to Bill from NYSERDA for the New York's Interagency Fire Safety Working Group presentation.
Great, thanks, Chris. Hey everyone, my name is Bill Oberkehr. I'm just going to try to get my screen up here. All right, I think we should see that.
Yep, perfect.
Great, thanks. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Chris said, my name is Bill Oberkehr. I'm a senior advisor on NYSERDA's Clean Energy Siting team. And I have been leading a lot of the day-to-day work for the past little over a year now of the Interagency Fire Safety Working Group. So just want to take this opportunity to let folks know, what the group consists of and what we've been doing. So first, to set the stage, as folks may recall, in the state of New York, we had 3 energy storage system fires within the span of 2 months. Or fires at 3 locations in the span of 2 months in summer of 2023. After the third location, the governor set up the Interagency Fire Safety Working Group. That was the one in Chameau in the North Country. The working group consists of the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, or DISHES, which is my favorite acronym in all of state government. And then a subset of DISHES is the Office of Fire Prevention and Control, or OFPC, NYSERDA, the Department of Department of Environmental Conservation, or DEC, Department of Public Service, DPS, and Department of State. So those are the kind of players here that the governor's office deemed, worthy of inclusion here, and the governor tasked with kind of sorting out some of the issues here with energy storage in New York. In addition to those state agencies, we have some really great partners working with the working group, very highly specialized subject matter experts in energy storage, and specifically in emergency response to energy storage. These are some of the best folks in the country, if not the world, who are partners of this group. They are folks who are sitting on the national standards and codes committees. So we had a lot of really, really deep knowledge guiding us as the state agencies through our response to crisis situation. The working group initially set out to collect and assess air, soil, and water testing data, review emergency response actions and data, and examine the root cause analyses of the fires. More on that in a little bit. The second component was to do a CS&R, Code Standards and Regulation review for energy storage, particularly fire code regulations. And then finally, the governor directed NYSERDA to do re-inspections of energy storage systems over a certain size, which is just wrapping up now. Over, I think, 65 projects. NYSERDA's quality standards and markets team has done a great job in getting those inspections done in a little over a year. It's just kind of a more of a deep dive here into the previous slide. So the incident analysis, the working group's first deliverable was a report and a press release in late 2023 that basically, compiled all of the environmental testing data. So whatever soil samples were taken, water samples were taken, air samples during the fires, compiled all of that, summarized the results, and then released the results. Pleased to report that there were no injuries or no damage to any property outside of the fence line of the projects, which is exactly how these systems are supposed to fail. That's why we have the fire code, to limit the damage to inside of the project's fence line, which was the case here. Emergency response analyses are forthcoming. Root cause analyses, we, long story short, determined that they're very difficult to get our hands on. So that is a work in progress as well. And then preliminary working group findings, to the extent that we've had findings so far, we have shared them with national labs for review and other national stakeholders. Codes, standards, and regulations review was actually completed in late July. So that went to the New York State Code Council. It was a series of 15 recommendations for inclusion in the fire code. The Code Council released code language to reflect those recommendations in late July of this year. The comment period for those through the Notice of Rule and Development process is ending September 24th. So right around the corner, if folks do want to take a look at that and provide comments on the draft code language, now's the time. Field assessments, as I said, we are almost finished with all of those. I think there's one left to go of the 65 or so that we set out to re-inspect. One of our working group partners is working on a summary for public release of the findings of those re-inspections. So we'll have that as soon as it's finished. We're hoping to get it through the door before Thanksgiving and the holiday season, but time will tell. And then finally, a final report. I think it's still too soon to say when this will be, just because we don't have control over or any indication over when the root cause analysis documents are going to be finished. And then after they're finished, when do we receive them? So that's really the final report is going to hinge on us receiving all of the information. And we can't really tell when that's going to be. But we can tell you that the final report will most likely be just kind of a packet of everything that the working group has done, maybe with an executive summary or something brief. But we've already produced, probably around 600 pages of material through the working group. So to add any more to that for the purpose of a final report would probably just be a little bit unwieldy. So 500 or more of those pages is in the initial report from December of last year that outlines all the air, soil, and water findings that from the testing done on site. As I said before, no reported injuries, no harmful levels of contaminants associated with the fires. And that's from air, water, and soil testing done in Chameau. Nothing out of the ordinary there. And then air testing and surface testing in Warwick. The school board of Warwick got an independent group to do surface testing inside of the area where the fire was, inside the buildings that were right there. Also turned up, nothing of note. And then soil testing was done a bit later at the East Hampton fire. And similar, all the levels of contaminants in the soil were consistent with the levels of control samples. So soil that wasn't affected by the fire had consistent levels of everything that the soil that was affected by the fire or potentially affected by the fire did. So that was all good news. Those findings are in a report. It is over 500 pages. Conveniently, there are a series of executive summaries at the front summarizing the findings from each incident. So it's a bit easier to understand than pouring through the tome of results that we have. Too fast. And then in July of 2024, the final fire code recommendation report and the notice of rule and development for the fire code was released. As I said before, there are 15 recommendations included in there. And they all only apply to large grid scale front of the meter systems. So the fire safety working group did not set out to address residential or small systems, what we call behind the meter systems, so systems that service a local load at all. So all these recommendations and the corresponding code language should only apply to these very large systems, or larger systems rather, that are feeding directly in the grid. We separated those recommendations into three categories. One was fire code updates. That's where we have language in the fire code that the working group felt could be, tightened up or clarified or slightly improved. Two is fire code additions, and that's kind of ideas that are at work in other standards that aren't the New York Fire Code or in New York City's rule, which is different from the rest of the state, kind of incorporating the best practices from those into the New York State Fire Code. And then finally, there was this miscellaneous bucket, just additional considerations. That's where the working group had identified some issues, some things that came up, and not necessarily issues. That's not a fair characterization. But there were just things that the working group discussed where we didn't land on a solid recommendation to the Code Council of what should be done about this, or working group, at length debated the issue and realized that, the code is not the appropriate place to handle a certain issue. That was the case, particularly with the root cause analysis. If folks have read this report, you'll see that there are a bunch of considerations around a root cause analysis, but then ultimately the group decided that the fire code is not an appropriate place to require a root cause analysis, that needs to be done elsewhere. So that's a pretty good taste of what's in that additional considerations category. Again, that draft code language to reflect those recommendations has been drafted and incorporated into the notice of rule and development. That is available on Department of State's website under notice of rule and development. I would strongly urge folks, if you have opinions or even just interested in review, again, that notice of rule and development comment period ends on September 24th. So just about a week left here to get comments in. And even if you don't want to comment, but you're interested in the subject matter, section 1207 of the fire code is where these recommendations are reflecting. Particularly if we have folks who are responsible for code enforcement or anything like that on the line, would really urge you to take a look through the regulations. Because what we're seeing is, having been out in the field a bit more in the wake of releasing these fire code recommendations, is that, folks have kind of the misunderstanding that these constitute a total overhaul of the fire code. That's absolutely not true. In fact, the working group deliberately tried to stick with existing national standards and industry standards to the extent that we could. And really what the working group set out to do was take the existing regulations in the 2020 fire code and then do a side-by-side comparison with the updated national regulations, which are the National Fire Protection Association 855 and the International Code Council's 2024 International Fire Code. So basically what we set out to do is do a side-by-side comparison between the 2020 New York Fire Code for energy storage and those updated standards, and just, kind of pull in what we thought would be appropriate. And then in addition to that, we did a comparison with New York City's rule. If folks don't know, New York City is widely recognized as a leader in energy storage, fire safety, nationally and globally. A lot of that is thanks to the work of FDNY. The folks have blazed a really great trail, and we, I think, would be wise to follow in their footsteps in a lot of ways. So that is what we set out to do. But the way that the Code Council develops fire code in the first place would be to take the International Fire Code, the International Code Council standard, which is a national standard despite the name, and then they would draw the New York Code from that. So really what the working group was doing is very, very similar to what the Code Council would have done anyway, but probably just spent a lot more time on this technology than the Code Council would have time to do, because the Code Council is responsible for the entire Uniform Code, which is several books that are all upwards of 1,000 pages each. So part of what the working group was doing was a dedicated effort to incorporate the best possible standards for this specific technology to make sure that it got the time and attention it deserved, even though, you know, we're more or less just doing an in-depth version of what the Code Council would have done anyway, and we were doing it just a little bit sooner. So instead of an overhaul of the fire code, which, as I said, I think is a gross mischaracterization, I think it makes more sense of it to think that the fire safety working group was just kind of doing extra homework on behalf of the Code Council before the due date. That's the way I think about it, at least, and that was really kind of what we set out to do. And these 15 recommendations are largely in line with the updated national standards. And as I said, a few things from New York City that we just borrowed and tried to incorporate them in a way that makes sense for a statewide context rather than, you know, one municipality within the state. In case folks can't tell, the fire safety stuff was near and dear to my heart, but that's probably enough on that. We do have some additional resources available for folks. The Interagency Fire Safety Working Group site is a subset of the NYSERDA site. That's going to contain links to pretty much everything that's been done, including the code recommendations and the notice of rule and development. So if folks want to look at that, you can find that through the Interagency Fire Safety Working Group site. The Office of Fire Prevention and Control has also come up with a couple resources to address this issue. One, there's a battery energy storage system fire service response guide that is geared toward local fire departments, folks who would potentially be arriving on the scene in the event of a fire. And then there's a lithium-ion battery awareness course through the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, or DISH's learning management system. So that should be available to all first responders in the state through the statewide learning management system. And then finally, my team at NYSERDA, the Clean Energy Siting team, specializes in kind of churning out resources. So there's a whole energy storage guidebook for local governments that contains model zoning language, a model permit, electrical checklist. Really worth checking out if you are in local government and dealing with energy storage development. And finally, there are a series of trainings for local governments on the website. These are all pre-recorded. They were done in spring and summer of 2021. I think they're still largely relevant. So if folks are interested in kind of decommissioning or fire safety or, you know, codes and zoning, there's a separate training for each one of those subjects under this energy storage trainings for local governments section of the Clean Energy Siting page. I would urge folks to check that out if you're interested in the subject matter, or if you're just having a little bit of trouble falling asleep one night. It's really handy for that. That's it for the commercial. I am happy to stick around for questions. If you have questions that we don't get to or more in-depth questions, please feel free to reach out to cleanenergyhelp@nyserda.ny.gov to contact us directly.
No, great presentation. Thank you, Bill. And we do have one question that got posted into the chat. Do you have a summary of the recommendations that you can either point attendees to or better talk about?
Yeah, I think the best way to do it is to look on the Interagency Fire Safety Working Group site. The full report is there. This material is very, very technical and very dense. So to try to do it justice in 5 minutes of Q&A is probably not going to work that well for anyone. So I would urge folks to just go on the Interagency Fire Safety site and download a copy of the report. It's not that long. I think it's only 10-15 pages, and it's in a professional layout, so it's very easy to read. And if folks do have questions, I would urge folks to reach out to cleanenergyhelp@nyserda.ny.gov, and we can have a more in-depth discussion as needed.
Okay. And we just had another question to come in. There's some curiosity about some rumors, I guess, that have been posed in reference to smart meters and fires. Do you have any information on that?
I do not.
Okay. And then I actually have a question myself as well that we've kind of had questions on from municipalities, especially more focusing on the battery energy storage systems. So we've had some municipalities ask, and I guess my question would be, have you seen any good examples or best work methods or best practices as far as ensuring that emergency management training is done in connection with the solar developer to have that resource available in case of any incidents and prevent any like big incidents from happening?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I'm glad you asked. So normally what we do is we draw a hard line between the uniform code, which is state law, and zoning regulations, which are inherently local. Those two shouldn't cross, they shouldn't really touch. The local emergency service training and the emergency response plan, that is one area where it is appropriate to include those requirements in site plan review, so that we are requiring, local emergency response training and an emergency response plan at the local level. That is, both of those things are in the recommendations as well. So we will likely see them in code in the next iteration of the uniform code. But in the meantime, I think that is one of maybe two areas of the recommendations that is actually appropriate for local adoption. And we would urge folks who are thinking about energy storage, land use regulations, certainly think about including in your site plan requirements, requirement for an emergency response plan, and require that the developers at least offer training to local first responders. The recommendation from the working group is annually. If you don't think that you need it annually, that's fine. But certainly, we do like to see language in there that says, recurrent trainings should be available, and whether the fire service has the time or the interest to take them up, that's another story, but they at very least should be on offer.
Okay, no, great, thank you. All right, do we have any other questions out there for Bill? Feel free to unmute your mic and just ask your questions directly, or you can still drop them in the chat box. But if there's any other questions out there, please feel free to go ahead and ask. Okay, I'm going to assume there's no other questions. Well, if anybody has any other questions that they might think of after the session, as Bill was mentioning, please email any questions to that website that's currently on the screen. You can also email them to us so we can get in touch with the presenters as well if for some reason you didn't get this address, this email address. But if there are any other questions out there, then again, thank you, Bill, for your presentation. Great information. But we will go ahead and we'll head into break. So break is scheduled from 10:30 to 10:45, and at 10:45 we will start the next session, which will be on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission relicensing process, which will be presented by Nick Tackett. We will start that at 10:45 on the dot. So enjoy your break. anybody has any questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop them into the chat box, or you can go ahead and raise your hand and we'll keep track of who wants to share a question at the end of the presentation. So this presentation that we'll be starting with after the break is going to be the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, also known as FERC, relicensing process, presented by Nicholas Tackett from the Great Lakes Hydropower Licensing, FERC Office of Energy Projects. So we got about 1 more minute, see if anybody else pops in, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Chris, I want to make sure that my audio is working and video also.
Yes, perfect.
All right, thank you, sir.
All right, again, good morning, everyone. So this is a presentation on Federal Energy Regulatory Commission relicensing process presented by Nicholas Tackett from the Great Lakes Hydropower Licensing, FERC Office of Energy Projects. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Nicholas to go ahead and provide the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to present. So as mentioned, I work for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the Office of Energy Projects, and am representing the Great Lakes branch in the Division of Hydropower Licensing. So today we'll discuss the hydropower relicensing process at FERC. Quick overview. I think I only have 30 minutes, so pardon me, but I will probably go relatively quickly through some of these slides. Of course, there'll be time at the end for us to discuss if we need more detail. So as a quick overview, I hope to describe our agency briefly and our jurisdiction over hydropower, the licensing processes that we have, how to submit study requests and then to dispute study determinations, how to submit measures that are relevant for potentially protecting the resources, mitigating concerns, and enhancing the environment, the context of licensing and settlement agreements. Also, how we approach the National Environmental Policy Act compliance process, and then our agency's determinations on a license application. And then, of course, focusing in on relicensing in the state of New York and how you can get involved and stay informed. So the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, is an independent federal agency, generally meaning that our agency is not subject to undue political preference. So we have 5 commissioners and a max of only 3 commissioners from one political party. 5 commissioners are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Their pictures are shared here. I'll just take this moment to say that my opinions and discussion today are based on my understanding of our regulations and statutory authority and not representing any of those of the commissioners. So our jurisdiction over hydropower is specific to non-federal hydropower projects, meaning projects that are not operated by other federal agencies. The projects are either located on navigable waters, federal lands, or use water from a federal dam. And if not any of those, there's a 3-part test to whether or not our jurisdiction applies. So it would be located on a non-navigable Commerce Clause stream, constructed after 1935, or affecting the interest of interstate or foreign commerce. So relatively broad in that regard. When I say interest of interstate commerce, typically speaking, that's connected to the electricity grid. You can think about it like that. So as mentioned at the very beginning in the title slide, we are discussing relicensing. That's the issue that I've been asked to speak about. And so I'll provide just a general discussion of the licensing process from that perspective. So licenses are granted with a term to not exceed 50 years. So every license that's issued by the commission will eventually have an expiration date. 5 years prior to that expiration date, we require certain information to be submitted if the applicant wants to continue to operate the project. Then 2 years before the expiration date, the application must be submitted. So those are timelines that are preset to govern the relicensing process. I'll go over those in a little bit more detail here, describing the first part, pre-filing. This period of time is 3 years, the time period between the 5 years that I mentioned earlier and the 2 years. So say we have a project that is expiring in 2030. They would submit what we refer to as a notice of intent and a pre-application document in 2025, 5 years before the expiration date. That would kick off the process. And the notice of intent is when a licensee comes in and says, yes, we do indeed intend to submit an application. We're seeking relicensing. And the pre-application document just contains basic information about the project, issues, potential measures, etc. So not to confuse things too much, but a year prior to that, so 6 years out, if you will, we do reach out to the licensee just to give them a heads up saying, look, your application is going to expire, say, for instance, in 2030. We also reach out to tribes to notify them that we are open to consultation, to inviting them to consult with us and inviting them to meetings. So after that notice of intent and pre-application document are submitted, assuming the licensee wants to continue to operate and maintain the project, we start into the pre-filing process. Again, 3 years. And that process, 3 years might seem like a long time, but it's needed to, first of all, allow sort of a venue for consultation between the applicant, resource agencies, NGOs, the public, and any other stakeholders that want to participate. In that context, issues are identified, issues germane to the relicensing, and information is gathered. So sometimes these studies can take multiple years, of course, to conduct. Say, for instance, there's a study on the fisheries. There might be multiple seasons needed, something like that. So this process within 3 years culminates in the filing of a license application. And that's 2 years before that expiration date. Using the example earlier, license application would need to be submitted by 2028. This is just a general description of what we refer to as the post-filing process. I'll go into a little bit more detail later as we unfold this. So a license application is filed and we provide an opportunity for comments. We then work through the National Environmental Policy Act process and produce a document that's then commented on by any stakeholders, and then results in an agency decision. And that agency decision we typically refer to as a license order. Okay, so pre-filing, post-filing processes, we covered those. There are different types of licensing processes available. So this is where things can get a little complicated. So if you have ever been part of any of these processes, you might have heard of the ILP or the TLP. Those are the two main ones that I'll cover today, because the ALP is rarely used. The ILP, or integrated licensing process, is the default process. We do a lot more hand-holding during pre-filing. FERC staff are in meetings, study meetings, scoping meetings early in the process. And these can be potentially more complex projects that need that extra level of help to reach resolution on study issues. TLP, the traditional licensing process, less hand-holding, less controversy, ideally, and situation should be where the applicant and the agencies and NGOs and other stakeholders can come to agreement on studies. Doesn't always happen, but That's the idea of the process. Like I said, the ALP, alternative licensing process, is rarely used. It involves even more collaboration in the pre-filing process. Okay, so there, of course, is available to all stakeholders opportunities to file study requests, and can occur mostly during pre-filing. That's where most of the different study issues are brought to light and where studies should typically take place. So just have some suggestions up here. When submitting a stakeholder, or I'm sorry, a study request, a stakeholder should attempt to broadly identify the goals and objectives. May sound easy, but we don't always get that. And so we want to know the purpose of the study. We want to know why it's needed. What types of resources are affected? How do project effects play into this study? What's the nexus? And how are the study results going to be used to inform a licensing decision? What's the study methodology? Is it consistent with scientific practice? And then also, what level of effort and cost is associated with the study? We need this information if we are going to weigh in on the need for a study. I have our regulations cited there. They differ, each of them differ a little. I tried to sort of summarize the broad level of information that we need, at least from my opinion. There is a process, of course, to dispute studies in certain circumstances. So a 1 in the IOP is provided for mandatory conditioning agencies. So that term, of course, can use a little definition. We have certain authorities in different contexts by statute that can submit conditions. And I'll go into a little bit of that later. Think, for instance, the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. They have the authority to issue water quality certifications. Those water quality certifications must be included in the license we issue. And so we refer to those as mandatory conditions. So those agencies, like the New York DEC, can dispute a study plan determination. And there's a process, of course, for that. We compose a panel, and the panel makes a finding, and then our Office of Energy Projects Director makes a decision on that finding. Parallel process for the TLP study dispute, although not with a panel. So the information is submitted, entities can respond to the dispute, and then again, the OEP director will resolve the dispute. Okay, so I spoke about the study process generally as occurring during pre-filing. There are opportunities to submit additional study requests through the TLP that I mentioned earlier, and the citation for that was on the previous slide. 4.32B7 of our regulations is where you'll find those, as mentioned in the slide earlier. As we transition to post-filing, that's the 2-year process that I mentioned earlier. We have a 2-year window between the time the application is filed and when that license expires. When we receive that application, Commission staff immediately dig in, and we're looking to see whether the application conforms to our regulations and whether it has the information we need to do our environmental review. You see the term there on the left, AIR, additional information requests. Once those are satisfied, we determine that we're ready to move forward, we issue a notice. In the middle box there, referred to the REA notice, ready for environmental analysis. That opens up the proceeding to comments, recommendations, terms, conditions, and fishway prescriptions. You can generally think of those as measures, environmental measures that are submitted, and I'll go through those. Again, we have the concept of mandatory conditions. These that I'll talk about are not in the context of water quality certifications, but rather from the Federal Power Act that we have obligations as a statute to follow. Section 4E conditions apply to federal reservations. So you can think, generally speaking, of a national forest. If a hydropower project is located in a national forest, the Forest Service could submit mandatory conditions focusing on the protection and utilization of that land reservation. Different examples here at the bottom of different conditions. We also have prescriptions, fishway prescriptions, submitted under Section 18 of the Federal Power Act. And we see these more often in the New York area. These involve fishways, upstream, downstream fish passage, again, mandatory conditions, typically in New York submitted through the U.S. Department of the Interior. And of course, Fish and Wildlife Service is working on those, typically speaking. And so I have some examples there of different fish passage conditions that can be included in a prescription, and that must be included in a license if filed. Okay, now switching from conditions, prescriptions to recommendations, if you'll bear with me. We have two different types of recommendations that we deal with under the Federal Power Act, 10J and 10A. I'll cover 10J here and 10A next. 10J recommendations deal with fish and wildlife resources specifically. These conditions come from federal and state fish and wildlife agencies. If they meet those two conditions, generally speaking, they're in the scope of Section 10J. Those recommendations should be included, must be included in a license, as long as they're consistent with the Federal Power Act and other applicable law. So I can give you a quick example of what we mean by consistent versus inconsistent with other law. Say 10J recommendation says that a fish passage route should be provided through a notch in the spillway of a dam. And then Interior, as mentioned earlier, submits a Section 18 saying fish should not have passage over the spillway, but should rather be released through this gate that provides a passageway to a plunge pool. The recommendation would be inconsistent with the passage required by the Section 18. That's an example of consistent versus inconsistent in terms of a Section 10J recommendation. Have some examples down here. The 10A is broader. It involves what we refer to as the comprehensive development. This is where our balancing, if anybody's ever heard of FERC balancing, this is where this comes into play. So anyone can submit a 10A recommendation, and it involves any number of different types of resources, as described here. I have some examples of project recreation. And when we talk about balancing, we're talking about looking at the benefits generally of the recommendation and comparing them with the potential effects of that recommendation on other resources, including the development itself, the hydropower development, so project economics, or other types of resources. One example might be that if we have a recommendation on whitewater boating flows, those boating flows could, of course, have an effect on trout in the stream. So we have to think, okay, practically speaking, how can we look at a comprehensive plan for this waterway? When should whitewater boating flows be provided, if at all? How could those affect the trout? And then, so what's the magnitude of flows? So the when and the how much questions come into play in a big way when we're thinking about 10A recommendations. Okay, I want to provide a little context for settlement agreements. We do see settlement agreements fairly routinely in New York, and we're talking about agreements. Let's just speak about comprehensive settlement agreements for now. We're talking about agreements between the applicant, resource agencies, NGOs, and other individuals. And they can involve a number of issues. fish, wildlife, recreation, cultural resources. So being more comprehensive in nature, they can save time, money, avoid litigation. Of course, ideally, settlement agreement would be submitted with the license application 2 years in advance. I just want to emphasize that because sometimes parties will try to get around the negotiation table after we're already in post filing. So a year or so before the license expires. And that can be somewhat of a tenuous position because, you know, we're looking at that license expiration date coming up. And of course, obviously a settlement agreement is a good thing, but there's a balance there, of course, in terms of potentially delaying the issuance of a decision and potentially the implementation of new environmental policies and conditions for that project. So ideally, a settlement agreement would be filed with the license application. Just like anything else we do, that settlement agreement would be opened up to comments. And the settlement would be exposed to the same type of criteria that we use for any other measures. So I mentioned Section 10A earlier and the balancing, public interest considerations. We really want to know, are there any other issues involved? There could have been somebody that wasn't allowed around the negotiation table. And so, of course, that comment process is helpful for us to be able to weigh in on the balancing and public interest considerations for even a settlement agreement. Okay. I thought this slide would be useful for everyone to get sort of in our minds when commission staff are looking at measures. You know, what do we think about, and what would be good for any stakeholder to include in a filing that they submit with us? So ideally, of course, the measure would be clear. I know it doesn't sound like it's asking for a lot, but sometimes we receive vague measures and we don't know what to do with them. They're not specific. We can't assign a cost to them, and we can't necessarily identify the exact benefits of a measure. So we look to have justification, support, explanation, kind of like with the study process, of the nexus between the measure and the project effects. What benefits you think there might be for resources, and just a recommendation to engage with the applicant and other stakeholders who might have the same interests early in the process to identify the measure as either being submitted under Section 10A of the Federal Power Act, Section 10J, et cetera. And then just to make sure that your filing includes measures that don't conflict with one another. For instance, flows. Oftentimes we can have intricacies of different flows under different circumstances. And so I want to make sure there's no conflict there, and that the measure is enforceable, so that we as an agency during the term of a license can actually enforce whatever the measure might be. And just to remember that every project is unique, at least in some respect. They're all located on a unique waterway with a unique configuration. So there's not a single measure necessarily applicable to all projects. Okay, just a little bit on how we implement NEPA as an agency. We have, of course, the basics, scoping process. So just as a quick rehash of earlier, ILP, integrated licensing process, our default. Scoping occurs during pre-filing. We want to try to get as much in as early as we can. TLP, traditional licensing process, scoping occurs after the license application is filed, so post-filing. After scoping, we then issue the NEPA document, so either environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, and then, of course, get comments on those. Our NEPA documents are very comprehensive. They include basics required under the statute, so purpose, need, description, what the affected environment is, and the environmental effects of each component. So the applicant's proposal, stakeholder measures, and how all of those result in different effects and alternatives. We also use the NEPA document as our vehicle for our biological assessment of threatened and endangered species. We do our economic analysis of the project in the NEPA document and look at those 10A issues that I described earlier. So the comprehensive development, the waterway. And we also consider other statutory requirements. So I think like Section 10J under the Federal Power Act or Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So any number of resource issues can be handled in our NEPA document, and some include all of the above. I just included this list here to show different types of resource issues that we typically address. Our license order, as I mentioned earlier, is the agency's decision on an application. So this is where we decide whether the project will continue to operate and be maintained, whether we approve of any new construction at the site, and what conditions should be included for the continued operation and maintenance. The license terms that we have are 30 to 50 years. We established a default of 40 years. The order specifically lines out the project facilities, boundary, conditions like I mentioned, and then the body of the order justifies those conditions. It says why we are requiring certain things. Also responds to comments that we might have received on the NEPA document. We speak about our regulations and statutory obligations. And then of course, our own statute under Section 4E and Section 10A, as I mentioned earlier, require equal consideration and comprehensive development. So I just copied those in there. Those are the underpinnings of our decision. As mentioned earlier, there are other statutory obligations. Clean Water Act. So we're looking for that water quality certification before we can move forward with the license order. Endangered Species Act, we consider for an endangered species, consultation under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, etc. Quite a few statutes to follow. Okay, now turning to specific Division of Hydropower Licensing branches. So in 2023, we created the Great Lakes branch. So we took portions of other branches focusing on areas across the states that drain into the Great Lakes. So New York has two different branches overseeing hydropower. And you see them highlighted there in blue, that's the Great Lakes branch, and in green, the Mid-Atlantic branch. Took a snapshot of this information that's available on our website to show the distribution of FERC-regulated hydropower projects in New York. As you can tell, there are quite a few in the Tug Hill region, and then of course on the east and south, and then just distributed throughout. It shows both licenses and exemptions. I didn't speak about exemptions today because they're not subject to relicensing, which is the subject of the conversation. So these links at the bottom take you directly to this information. All right. We have quite a few pending relicense proceedings in New York. When I say pending, I mean those that are in post-filing. The application has already been filed, as indicated there on the left. We just had a few come in over the last couple months. And you can see we have a wide range of sizes there on the second to the right, different capacities, 800 kilowatts, see all the way up to almost 42 megawatts. towards the bottom. And we have licenses that are coming in, applications that are coming in. So took a reading of that and summarized here in the table. Due dates coming up for several fairly soon. And then the bottom table shows the due dates for notices of intent that I mentioned earlier. So those would be coming in starting that 5-year process. Again, quite a wide range. If you ever wonder, TL there, bottom table, second row, TL transmission line. That's why it doesn't have any kilowatts associated with it. It's a transmission line only project. Okay. All right, now with the time we have left, I think we have maybe just a minute or two. With the time we have left, I suggest areas of ways of getting involved and staying informed. So definitely it's to your benefit to participate in pre-filing to the greatest extent possible, to review the filings that are submitted, so the pre-application document, different study plans that are submitted by the applicants, to participate in meetings, get around the table. Then in post-filing, reviewing the applications. Some of these can be kind of lengthy, so doing your best to cover the issues, looking through, we have different exhibits in these license applications. So Exhibit A, just a general characterization, it's a good place to start. Exhibit E, you can focus on your specific environmental issue. Reviewing the NEPA doc that commission staff issues, and then filing comments and recommendations at any point in the process. Definitely different ways of staying informed. Commission staff uses e-subscription. So all of these different ways are available on our FERC online system, and there's the link there. With e-subscription, you receive email notifications of any filings or issuances pertaining to a specific docket project. RE Library is comprehensive too. Anything that happens within the docket of a project is available. So all public documents are available on eLibrary. If you have a project, you enter in the docket number and you just enter the time period that you're looking to and can get the information you need. You can also get on the mailing list if you want to receive hard copies of filings and issuances. Just included a couple helpful links here. These are go-tos. I use these quite frequently myself. Hydropower page, licensing page, and then just fun here, the Hydropower primer, which describes both licensing and compliance. All right, that is the end of the slide deck, and I can stop sharing my screen. Let's see here. Maybe. Do you know how to do that, Chris?
I stopped sharing.
Oh, it did? Good.
Yep.
Okay, it didn't give me a signal after I pushed it, so thank you.
Thank you. A lot of great information. I actually found it, it was actually kind of nice seeing that chart and to see all the relicensing projects, especially that are coming up towards the end of this year and beginning of next year in the Tug Hill region. But no, a lot of good information. I haven't seen any questions in the chat box. So if anybody has any questions for Nicholas, please feel free to unmute your mic and go ahead and go direct.
The licensing process can be somewhat overwhelming. There might not be any interest in questions.
I was going to say, silence usually means lack of questions. But with that being said, if anybody kind of thinks of a question later or anything like that, feel free to reach out, send us an email, with your questions. We can go ahead and get in touch with the presenters again, send them out to the appropriate office, and hopefully get some answers that we can return back to you. So if there aren't any questions for Nicholas, again, thank you for the presentation and sharing all that great information. Like you said, I know it's a lot to kind of delve into in a 30-minute time period, but it's definitely a lot of great information, and that can call for further research. So, but no, thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Hey, Nick, I actually have one quick question.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to think back to a meeting that I went to, and I wanted to confirm. So like when people are submitting written comments for the upcoming relicensing process, are they also able to include, and I apologize if you mentioned it, are they able to include comments that include like recreational compartments of things like trails or like different areas, like if for like I'm thinking of like around like the Brookfield Renewable hydroelectric facility. Like we have a Black River Trail in the Watertown area that's associated with their facility. Are they able to, like when submitting those written comments for things to think about during that relicensing process, are they able to like submit things like recommendations that they might like to see or upgrades or anything like that?
Yeah, just generally speaking, because I can't speak about specific projects, but
Right.
yeah, generally speaking, that's what I mentioned earlier under section 10A. So we would look at those. Those are comments, recommendations. So if you look at the comment side of things, you could have somebody come in and say, hey, we use this trail quite frequently, and provide information potentially about things they've seen on the trail. So comments about potential effects that the project might be having on recreation use. Recommendations, separate from comments, recommendations could be on specific areas of interest that you recommend to be included in the license. So there could be a hiking trail, like you indicated, along a shoreline of an impoundment where that it's a popular bird viewing area, say for instance for migratory birds or something like that. You could recommend some sort of enhancement to that trail. And what we do is we look at recreation in the context of the project. So of course, if the trail's 5 miles away outside of the project boundary, we don't have jurisdiction over that land that's 5 miles away. But right there around the impoundment, if it's in the project boundary, we could say, okay, there seems to be some sort of benefit associated with this or not. And, whatever the recommendation is, we would analyze in the NEPA document and then in the license order.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we actually have another question from Jill Hank from the Adirondack North Country Association.
Okay.
Are you seeing instances of existing generators increasing capacity? If yes, do they need to relicense?
Okay, so try to interpret the question. There is a process so we have different divisions in the Office of Energy Projects. If a project is currently within a license term, say for instance, we issued a 40-year license and they're 20 years in, and that licensee 20 years in, for some reason or another says, well, we want to add a turbine, or we want to rewind the turbine and increase capacity, or change the gate in some way, increase capacity. That would go through our Division of Hydropower Administration and Compliance, so DHAC, Hydropower Administration and Compliance, and they would process that amendment to the license. So at that point in time, the license would be formally amended so that it reads different. So you might say, well, instead of it being a 5.1 megawatt project, it's now a 5.2 megawatt project. So that would actually be written into the new license, or the amended license. As part of the license proceeding, though, separate from that, say they submit a license application and they want to increase capacity, that does take place in the context of the license proceeding. So we, within the Division of Hydropower Licensing, would look at that proposal to increase capacity and make a determination on it and evaluate the environmental effects associated with it.
All right, no, thank you. All right, so if there are no other questions for Nicholas, I'd like to say again, thank you for taking the time, providing this presentation with all the great information to all the attendees. We will go ahead and head into our next session, which is going to be on the Renewable Action through Project Interconnection and Deployment, also known as the RAPID Act, which will be presented by Sarah Crowell from the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, also known as ORES. So with that, again, same housekeeping rules. I'm going to go ahead and post them in the chat as well to reference, but some quick hits right off the back is just please stay muted throughout the duration of the presentation. Everybody should already come in muted anyways. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box and we'll go ahead and get to them with the time left at the end of the presentation. Or you can use the raise your hand icon and we'll go ahead and identify those that raise their hands, and we'll also call upon you at the end of the question, at the end of the session there. So this will be recorded, and with that, we'll go ahead and turn this over to Sarah from the Office of Renewable Energy Siting.
Thanks for having me. I need to load up my, I need to share my screen, so hang on a second. And typical, actually wait, typical Zoom meeting spirit, I will mess it up as usual. So just give me a second. Share. I need to get it into presentation. Okay. 1 second, I apologize. So while I figure this out, I can introduce myself. I'm Sarah Crowell. I'm the program manager for the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, and now the Office of Renewable Energy Siting and Electric Transmission. And I am going to talk to you about, in that role, I oversee the siting of all utility scale renewable energy projects, both mostly solar and wind. We haven't had anything else yet. I'm trying to find you so that I can share this. Nope. I'm so sorry. I seem to have lost. I can't see you underneath my Zoom screen. So just 1 second. I mean, I can't under my. Oof. All right. I am here. You don't see my screen, do you? Or do you see a screen? Okay. Hold on a second. Now I'm going to share it.
Okay.
Again, apologies. Share. Bear with me. Hold on. Share. Okay.
Yep.
You see a screen, I assume.
You can see your email.
Okay. No, I can hear. I'll close that and you can look at the Plattsburgh Wind Farm while I get my PowerPoint back up. Oh. I swear I'm actually not this technologically inept. Just at the moment I am. Okay. So here we are. We are very close from beginning. Okay.
Perfect.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. Excellent. So anyway, I introduced myself. Let's move on so I can get through this. So I just wanted to start with a quick review of the CLCPA, or the Climate Leadership Protection Act. I'm sure that everyone is aware of the act, but just want to highlight a couple of things. When it was passed in 2019, we at New York State committed ourselves to very ambitious clean energy targets. Amongst those were reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% from 1990 levels, and by 2030, and 85% from 1990 levels by 2050. And particularly relevant for today's discussion, we also committed ourselves to attaining 70%, a goal of 70 by 30 is what the goal is called generally. That means that 70% of our electric demand should be provided by renewables by 2030. And by 2040, we should have attained a totally emission-free electric demand system. So those are some tall orders, as you know. So ORES, or the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, was established within the Department of State by the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act of 2020, and there is no good acronym for that originally, but so we just have to call it that. That was passed in 2020 to address the critical need to speed up development of large-scale renewable energy in order to meet the CLCPA goals. So until that time, until that was passed, renewable energy facilities for 25 megawatts or greater, which we consider large scale, were approved through the Article 10 process under the jurisdiction of the Board of Electric Generation, Siting, and the Environment. And under the new act, ORES was charged with creating a streamlined and expedited one-stop environmental review and siting process, and this needed to be based on a set of uniform standards and conditions. So our process is designed, the ORES process is designed to provide consistency and predictability for renewable developers and for the community, and also to be, while being as efficient as possible, but also ensuring that all impacts have been avoided, minimized, and mitigated to the greatest extent possible. So that was a tall order. So we have, but ORES has been in operation for a few years now. So just in the past year, we awarded 7 projects in 2023. We've awarded 1 permit to date in 2024, with 2 others very close. In the 4 years that we've existed, we will have permitted a total of 16 projects. No, we will have permitted a total of 18 or more, we think, which is a total of over 2 gigawatts of clean energy. And we do have at least 15 to 20 additional permits in the pipeline. So we are very, very busy. I noted already that our process is designed to be very efficient. Projects must also, notably projects that we approve, must comply with substantive local laws, or unless they request a waiver. The waiver needs to be justified, justified by demonstrating that the local law in question is overly burdensome in light of the CLCPA targets. So new to the permitting process was the pre-application process, a formal pre-application process. That time allows the office to work with the applicant. We ensure that the application is as complete as possible and is approvable. That process is really critical because once the application has been submitted, there really isn't an opportunity to make any additional changes to the project. So we continue to improve the process, and we continue to work to address some of the, oops, I lost my, sorry about that, did not mean to do that. You know, so we continue to sort of try to improve our process, but during the application process, if an applicant is missing materials, we will issue a notice of incomplete application. Once an application is complete, we do, that's when our sort of statutory timeline begins. So the Rapid Act, which was passed this past budget, did a couple things. One, it transferred the Office of Renewable Energy from the Department of State, where we were housed, to the Department of Public Service. And that sort of created some, that seemed to make sense. It creates some synergies and some efficiencies as we can sort of share resources and work together. But it also sort of one of the biggest changes is that it gave ORES jurisdiction over electric transmission facilities. That the reason that was done was because, of course, we need to, once the renewable energy, the generation is built, those electrons need to get to the kilowatts, because the electrons, as I've been told, do not move. But we need to get the kilowatts to the customers, and in order to do that, there are some significant upgrades required of our existing system, upgrades and expansions. So this process, so through RAPID, ORES has empowered to issue permits for electrical transmission facilities without the involvement of the Public Service Commission. Previously, these were, well, currently, because this isn't yet in effect, our electrical transmission, our facilities are all reviewed and approved through the Article 7 process. There we go. So the RAPID Act, in addition, it transferred our authority. It transferred the authority. It transferred all of our existing authority over to public service law, but I mean, there are no meaningful changes to generation. There are a couple little things, but we don't need to go into those now. But it does, while it completely revises Article 7, there were some significant pieces of Article 7 that remained. It's still applicable, obviously, to the same electrical transmission facilities, like Article 7 and like the existing generation process. The applicant does have to provide intervenor funding that is made available to municipalities and other parties that may need that funding in order to fully hire consultants or attorney in order to effectively advocate for themselves and be a part of the process. In addition, all procedural requirements are exempt, and substantive local law requirements can also be waived under the same requirements as with the same justification as would be required for generation. I should note also that in generation and now under RAPID for transmission, other state laws that may apply are now come under the jurisdiction of ORES. So ORES really becomes a one-stop shop for these applications. So as I mentioned, one of the sort of central ways that the ORES process streamlines and makes more predictable the review process and the permitting process is by developing and applying a set of uniform standards and conditions. Those uniform standards and conditions will be enshrined in our regulations, and they're sort of conditions that will be applied to, that will be included in every permit, and they are developed to really try to address everything that may come up and that may need to be addressed under a transmission permit. It should note that these are not, the uniform standards and conditions will not be new for transmission. While it's a new, they'll be written up in generations. I mean, in regs, so that will be new. They are all. They will be developed. They will be based on existing conditions that are part of that have been placed on Article 7 certificates, as well as on ORES's existing generation uniform standards and conditions. One issue unique to transmission that can't be addressed by USCs is the requirement that there be a public need determination. So under Article 8, ORES is required to identify and make public the basis for the public need for an electrical transmission facility in a written finding. So there will be a written finding of public need for every transmission project consistent with law. So I just wanted to go through quickly how this new process works. So as I mentioned, there is a robust pre-application process. Once that is done and the applicant is ready to file an application, that application does get filed with ORES. Once it's filed, that starts a 120-day clock for completeness determination. That's different. Under generation, that's a 60-day clock. It's 120 days for transmission to acknowledge the fact that transmission is, I mean, these long, just by their characteristics, it's a long, narrow, narrow corridor, affects more municipalities. There's more to look at. So then ORES has up to 120 days to either determine that the application is complete or to issue a notice of incomplete application. Once the notice of incomplete application, if a notice of incomplete application is issued, the developer, the applicant then has to go back and address those areas that the NOIA specifies. At that point, and then it starts over again. There's the 120-day clock. Once ORES does issue a completeness determination, I should note also that if ORES does not issue either a formal determination, either that they're either a NOIA or a completeness determination in 120 days, it will default to complete. So that this timeline is enforceable. Applicant may consent to an extension at any time if they would like, but that has to be an agreement between the applicant and ORES. So as I mentioned, this really is an expedited review. So once an application is deemed complete, there's a 60-day clock during which time ORES has to issue a draft permit that lists all of not only the uniform standards and conditions, but also at times in many cases there are also site-specific conditions which are developed to address any specific sort of unique issues with regard to a particular project. Once an application is complete, we have 1 year to issue a final permit decision. Extensions are permitted, but certainly we don't expect there to be a lot of requests for extensions. So after the draft permit is issued, there's a 60-day public comment period. And during that time, the municipality also will submit a statement of local law compliance. This will not be the first time, far from the first time that the municipalities will see these applications, but this is a formal opportunity to weigh in. In addition, any party can raise a substantive and significant issue. Whether or not an issue is substantive and significant is determined by the office and by our ALJs. If there is an issue, our ALJs may hold adjudicatory hearings and issue a determination. So while, as I mentioned, ORES is not yet reviewing transmission projects at the moment. So Article 7 is still in effect while we develop the regulations that will allow us to start reviewing. So while Article 7 is still in effect, applications still can come in under Article 7 and will be reviewed. In addition, all existing certificates that have been issued under Article 7 are now considered permits issued by ORES and will be so there'll be no difference between a permit issued prior prior to rapid and after rapid is in effect. So one question is opt-in. When ORES was originally created for generating solar or wind facilities that had already entered the Article 10 process, were able to opt in and just transfer their application wherever they were over to the ORES process. In this case, after ORES issues our regulations and implements Article 8 for electrical transmission, the only way that Article 7 applicants can opt in would be by starting at the beginning and filing an application, a full application. There's no shortcuts. So you know, we can't just because they are such different processes. And we don't know who will opt in and who won't, but we'll see. So I just want to point out that these permits are enforceable the same way that Article 7 permits are enforceable and our generation permits are enforceable. They all, you know, and there are penalties, court action associated with various violations. So where are we now? We are, as I mentioned, we can't put this into practice until we have regulations. So the statute, the Rapid Act, required ORES to promulgate regulations within 1 year of the passage of the act. So the bill was signed April 20th, 2024. So we have until April 20th, 2025 to promulgate regulations. So, and we are deep in that process now. Some of the considerations that are sort of guiding these regulations include that we've determined that pre-application work for transmission should all be able to be completed via desktop survey, simply because these could be very long corridors and requiring field work may be a little. It seems more than what should be required during pre-application. However, where land rights exist, applicants can choose to do field work during pre-app. It also defines different project types. We wanted to define substantial projects that are substantially within an existing right of way, as well as projects that are in water facilities, in order to treat those slightly differently, to acknowledge that there are different ways we treat those. Projects that are within existing rights of way and rebuilds have a very, can be permitted very quickly, and there are some shortcuts that are built in. We also recognize that projects involve both underground and overhead components, and that those components are those impacts are very different. As I mentioned, there are off ramps for certain types of projects, such as those within existing right of ways and rebuilds. We are also it will also include, as the generation regs do, statutorily required exhibit elements. So it outlines what the exhibits need to be in the application and what needs to be in those exhibits. So as we develop the regulations, here's just wanted to sort of touch on some of the highlights. The application will require exhibits that cover all of the applicable topic areas. And we added some. This is based on the model that we have in place now for generation, but in this case, the topic, there are some additional areas that are particular to transmission. One of those is corridor selection alternatives analysis. So that I'll talk about a little bit later. It also includes a preliminary description of construction practices that we don't require for generation. Cost, public need, specific requirements for in-water facilities, and we put guidance in place of some prescriptive language where appropriate. In general, the USCs the uniform site conditions in the new Article 8 process are a blend of the previous Part 994C, which are that's the old ORES regs, and they sort of blend Article 7 certificate requirements and what is already being done in generation. So there is precedent for all of these, all of the USCs, where Article 7 and Part 900 had similar conditions. We tried to go with the Part 900 structure because we're trying to, because that's been vetted already, and this is supposed to mimic that structure. But notably, there are no new substantive requirements in USCs. This is entirely based on precedent. The idea here is to make this more predictable, not to make it more onerous. We did remove Article 7 settlement language. Settlement is what happened, for those of you who aren't familiar with Article 7, sort of after, at the backside of the process. Settlement it could be a very lengthy process. Instead, most of that is moved up into the pre-application process. I keep talking about pre-application. So pre-application is really a key, it's key to accelerating the permitting process. Because as I said, it eliminates the settlement, and it eliminates, there's no post-completeness discovery unless a hearing is required, which means that there's very little that can change and that can require an extensive additional review. So the pre-application front loads consultation with ORAS and with other stakeholders, and requires sort of early identification of the resources that are crucial to the permitting process, and it moves everything up. This sort of process, this pre-application structure is established in the generation regs. And in fact, pre-app really did exist, although informally, in Article 7. There's no formal requirement for pre-app, but applicants have found the need to, have identified the need to work with the different parties early on. So this will, we hope to also design it so it'll accelerate other processes such as federal permitting, which we cannot waive. So as I said, the pre-app process follows is similar to what we required in what we require for generation. This is just a list of the things that we expect to happen, that we expect the applicant to look at, and before pre-app. Before the application is submitted. As I mentioned, the pre-app can be completed via desktop survey. This is different than generation, because it is one sort of discrete site. We do sometimes require some field visits and things like that, but that's not required that won't be required for transmission. They can perform field work if they want to. And during the, should point out that one of the reasons that we do require field work and generation is in order to address some of the wildlife, the threatened and endangered species impacts and archaeological impacts. If that field work does need to be done, it will be done at sort of the end of the process. If it hasn't been done during pre-app, at that point, we will have already identified sort of the worst case scenario of where habitat may be. And we will have had a draft take determination for either wildlife or wetlands can be reduced based on field surveys at the end. A critical part of pre-application is public participation. Public participation requirements aren't new. Article 7 required applicants to develop a PIP or a public information plan. Article 8 does not require a PIP, but it does have mandatory consultations with municipalities and informational sessions for community members. And the application has to include a description of the results of the consultation, the outreach, and explain why what they did was sufficient. We do tell applicants that this is the minimum, the mandatory consultation and the information sessions, and we do expect them to have a robust public participation process. Also new is corridor selection. Applicants have to consult with ORAS regarding preferred and reasonable alternative routes. This is only true for greenfield or new projects if a project is in an existing right of way. well, they only need to consult with ORS to discuss whether there might be anything that they should consider as an alternative. So if a proposed transmission facility falls into any of the three categories you see here, they just need to meet with ORS. They don't need to, there's no need to actually analyze in the application alternatives. However, for everything else, anything that any transmission projects that don't fit into those three criteria, we do conduct an alternative scoping procedure. This will happen at least 6 months before the application is filed, and it will give the municipalities and relevant stakeholders an opportunity to chime in and provide comment on those alternatives, and also to potentially propose additional alternative routes. However, ultimately, the office will determine which alternative routes or routes that the applicant has to analyze in their application. Again, the draft. So when a draft permit is issued, as I said, it will include the uniform standards and conditions, which, as I mentioned, are based on Article 7. There's precedent for every single condition that there's precedent for the conditions that will be in the regs. And however, it doesn't necessarily, we aren't necessarily just adopting everything that has been ever included in as a condition in an Article 7 application. We only want to capture those that really seem common and commonly applicable and reasonable. Note, in order to keep these projects moving, we are allowing for, we're requiring that the project gets started within 2 years of the permit being issued. That's consistent with Article 7, and it's really in there to get these things built. So compliance filings are filings that are, they're common called EM and CP. They are required to be filed after the permit is issued and before a project is built. In that point, we can approve some minor changes, but they're in practice, these really should just be some more detailed drawings and detailed construction drawings and things like that that are necessary to develop the project. And that is the end of my presentation. So I want to thank you very much. I actually should have had a slide in there, and I don't think it is in there, that at the timing of the regs. So let me just tell you that quickly. We are in the process of drafting transmission regulations right now. Those will go out for public comment as part of the rulemaking process by the end of the year, I believe. And we also are going through a seeker environmental review of the regs themselves. So that's sort of where we are, and we do expect to have them in place in April of 2025. With that, I will stop sharing.
No, thank you, Sarah. A lot of great information, especially with ORS, because I know that's kind of a continuing, developing, and changing thing. So, but with that, are there any questions for Sarah? Whether you can go ahead and drop them in the chat, or you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your questions directly.
Actually, if one other thing, while people are thinking, one other thing I actually could mention, while you talked about ORS changing, and that is true. So I just wanted to let folks know that one of the areas that we're really focusing on is well, two areas. One are continuing to try to streamline generation, but also to increase our sort of transparency and our presence in the communities. We want to be, so we are trying to go out, meet with community members. We are also willing to come out, even if there isn't an application process, just to talk about talk about how ORS works. But we really want this to be, we don't want it to be a mystery. We want people to understand, because there is a real role for municipalities in the process, and We just don't want it to look like a black box because it really is not. So
No, I am actually glad you mentioned that, and that kind of brings up a question that I have is some of the smaller municipalities. I don't want to say it's completely negative, but they don't have a very positive, I guess positive holding of ORES. So how active is this, like, the organization with these smaller communities that are like these rural communities, especially say in the Tug Hill region, to try and bridge that gap between what ORES is actually doing and how it can protect and benefit communities versus how they kind of perceive what ORES is?
yes, agreed. There are definitely some perceptions out there that ORES is going to come and sort of steamroll the community, that we're a rubber stamp. Neither of those things are true. We actually have an office full of subject matter experts who are very passionate about their subjects and are to give these very thorough reviews. But in terms of the communities themselves, one of the things that we're trying to do at, once there's an application, once there's clearly something that as early as possible, once we know there's a project being proposed in a community, is we actually reach out to the community, and we are sending our staff to go out and meet with the supervisors or whomever want to, to talk through how ORES works and when and how the community can participate, what a waiver is, what it isn't, and what we look at, really anything, just anything that the supervisors or anybody else want to ask, and we're also available to answer questions. Other than that, we've also been trying to go out, do things like this, go out to present at conferences, just talk to people, open the door so that the folks know who to reach out to, and understand that there is an opportunity for municipalities to participate.
Okay, no, great. So again, thank you for the presentation and the great information, and I hope you continue to go out there and be actively engaged with these communities and continue providing this type of information and discussion forums. So with that, if there's no other questions for Sarah, or if you think of questions later, go ahead and email us directly, and we'll get in touch with Sarah and provide the questions. But if there are no other questions for Sarah, then this will conclude this session and the renewable energy track. So next on the agenda is actually lunch from 12 to 1, and there'll be an introduction to the New York State Tug Hill Commission during that time. So I hope everybody enjoys their lunch and then continues on with the sessions in the afternoon. But yeah, if there's nothing else, I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thank you all for having me. Just, in addition, in the spirit of what I just talked about, if you have any questions, please do pass them on. And if you have any thoughts as to what we could do better, or any place we can present or anything we can do, please do pass those on as well. We are trying, we are in a constantly changing. We're still very young. All right. Thank you all so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, Sarah.